Hi, I'm Robert Tyminski, and I'm a Jungian psychoanalyst and writer living in San Francisco. I've written 4 books, but I'd like to tell you now about my most recent book, The Psychological Effects of Immigrating. What I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book. Immigration has become something of a heated topic in the United States in recent years. Despite the fact that we're a nation of immigrants, almost 14% of our population are immigrants right now, and that's over 46 million people. Surprisingly, the psychological research into immigration has only taken off in the past 20 years or so. Before that, not a whole lot of attention was paid to it, but now there is a lot more research going on about the mental health effects of immigrating to a new place. One fact makes this clear. Over half the companies in the Fortune 500 were started either by immigrants or their children. During the years that I've worked as a psychologist, I've been fortunate to work with many immigrants, and I've been continually surprised and amazed at their resilience and how they cope and adapt to new circumstances and fitting in to a new place. I've worked with many children whose parents have also immigrated to the United States, and through their eyes, I've seen some of what can be challenging. My book provides many examples of adults as well as children who are coping and dealing with the psychological effects of how their immigration has landed for them. Right now, there are approximately 280 million global migrants. These are people who are moving and seeking new homes, people who are fleeing wars, violence, persecution, and discrimination, people who are fleeing environmental disasters that have made their homes unlivable, people who want better lives for their children. Immigrants are highly motivated to find something better than what they've known before. I have a personal interest in this topic. My grandparents were immigrants, and on my father's side, they came to the United States over 100 years ago from a country that at the time didn't even exist, Poland. The immigration documents that they have often say that they came from either Austria or Russia because they lived at the frontier of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. When they arrived in the United States, again over 100 years ago, immigration was fairly open. The peak year for immigration to the US was in 1907. From 1820 to 1920, there are about 2.2 million people who immigrated to the United States from lands and territories that are associated with the country of Poland. My book provides a variety of perspectives on immigration. I look at research about immigration and mental health, I include clinical examples, and I also draw on a rich literary tradition that we have about immigration experiences. For example, I introduce readers to David, a young Jewish boy in Henry Roth's book, To Call It Sleep. Roth shows us a child's confusion at fitting in while learning a new language that's not used at all at home. It's a wonderful story about family secrets and how a child adapts to a new cultural setting. I think of my book as like a mosaic because I employ and use different perspectives to appreciate that there are many sides to immigration. Besides clinical, literary, and research materials, I discuss the older mythical tale, the Aeneid. The Aeneid was written by Virgil, and it tells us about the Trojans who fled after the Greek armies had sacked their city of Troy. It builds on the epics of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The leader of the Trojans is Aeneas, and he struggles to guide his people to Italy. Their story is very interesting for the many components in it that relate to anyone's migration, such as tremendous efforts, heroism, multiple detours, a variety of losses, fights, acceptance, and rejection. The Trojans aren't welcome when they finally do arrive in Italy, and they have to fight, negotiate, and rely on luck in order to be able to stay there and settle. I think that myths are powerful living stories, and we can appreciate from the Aeneid that migration is an ancient tale, that we as human beings have almost always been on the move. The Aeneid has inspired many artists. For example, the Italian painter Salvatore Rosa painted a scene of Aeneas having a dream about his future. There's also a famous statue by Bernini at the Borghese Gallery in Rome. That sculpture shows Aeneas carrying his father Anchises, while his son Ascanius grips to his legs. The English painter Turner and the Dutch painter Rubens also found inspiration in the Aeneid. There's a well-known ancient statue at the Vatican Museum of Laocoon and his sons who are being attacked by giant sea serpents, and it shows us a scene from the Trojan War, which we learn about in the Aeneid. Laocoon was a temple priest, and he tried to warn his fellow Trojans the gift of a winged horse from the Greeks was a trick. Gods favoring the Greeks intervened to kill him. Such art as I'm telling you about is important because it shows us the archetypal foundations of the Aeneid. These are timeless aspects. Immigration involves three phases: pre-migration, when a person is planning to leave; the migration itself, when they're in transit, often for long periods; and then their resettlement in their new country. There are dangers at each of these stages, and it would be a mistake to think that any of them is smooth. The formal term refugee is legally defined, and I explain that in my book. In most ways, immigrants and refugees have many areas of overlap when it comes to their psychological adjustments. One spot where there can be a big difference is when a migrant has experienced traumatic events. These can occur at any point during a migration process. Trauma is a complicated topic that I cover at some length in my book. It's important to note that even when a person has been exposed to trauma or traumatic events, resilience is almost always a factor in their healing and recovery. Once resettled, an immigrant goes through a process of acculturation. This can be emotionally taxing, and acculturative stress refers to the various kinds of emotional pressures that they feel during this period. There are various acculturation strategies. Integration is a kind of biculturality in which an immigrant retains what's of value from their heritage and their traditions, while also contributing and joining in their new country. Separation can happen when immigrants feel isolated in their new country, and all they can really do is hang on to their old traditions. Marginalization is kind of the worst of all possible worlds when immigrants feel unaccepted and lose not only their old traditions, but don't really learn anything new to replace them. Assimilation is an older view on immigration, and it's linked to the melting pot idea in the United States. A problem with that strategy is that it means that an immigrant has to give up their heritage, culture, and traditions in order to conform to a new one. In many ways, it's integration that is the most helpful and hopeful of all these strategies. There are many obstacles to immigration. In the United States, the last far-reaching immigration reform happened in 1986, almost 40 years ago. There were smaller pieces of legislation in 1996 and 2001 after 9/11, but those were aimed at tightening our borders and making entry much harder. Since then, administrative policies about immigration have changed erratically depending upon which political party has control of the government. And because of that, immigration to the US can be rigid, unpredictable, and inhumane. Another obstacle is xenophobia, which is an exaggerated fear of what is foreign or strange. So xenophobia, as we commonly understand it, is an irrational fear of foreigners. Xenophobia has unfortunately been on the rise in the United States and other countries. Politicians and others have used both coded and explicit messages to stir up resentments about immigration and immigrants. Many immigrants have painful stories to relate about being on the receiving end of xenophobic attitudes. I mentioned that my book is like a mosaic. I think of mosaics as a useful way to conceptualize what we've often called identity. Identity has become a fraught term, especially in psychology, because what we call ourselves changes frequently over the course of a lifespan. Rarely are any of us the same over time. Identity does matter for legal and demographic purposes, but as a psychological concept, it can make something appear true when it might not be. Many times we call ourselves a thing because we've been told that we are that thing, and often it's not that simple. In my book, I offer an idea about perimeters, which I think of as external markers and rules that can be used to define a person. Immigrants know this process very well. For example, illegal or undocumented are kinds of legal language that define a person, regardless of what their story is. My book is really about how people tell stories. Of course, we're all interested in stories. When we're children, we learn that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But they're really not so orderly. And that's part of what makes them curious. That's what interests us in stories. Part of a psychotherapist or psychoanalyst's daily job is to listen to stories and help people try to understand them. In particular, we look at where the stories have gaps, where they're missing pieces, where there's information that doesn't quite seem to make sense, and where things don't add up. This is a really big part of my book. Children in particular, and immigrants overall, have a lot of stories to tell that have these kind of gaps and missing pieces in them. It might be that there's a date that doesn't make sense. It might be that there's something on a document that doesn't quite look right. Or it might be that there's something they heard in the family that they just don't understand. These become mysteries. Children like to investigate and figure out stories. Think about the energy they bring to the board game Clue, trying to figure out who did it and why and where it happened. Well, that's part of an immigration story too. So part of my book, a big part of my book, is about how these stories are told. And we look at those gaps and we try to understand what has happened and what has not been told yet.
Hi there. I've been on the move too. I've switched locations and now I'm at home in my office, where I'd like to read to you a selection from my book, just to give you a sense of how I write and to see if you might want to read more. This is an excerpt from the last chapter. As a child, I was often confused by what I heard of my grandparents' immigration stories. My Polish grandparents on my father's side claimed a nationality that did not officially exist at the time they came to the United States because Poland had been partitioned between Prussia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Russia. I have a copy of my grandmother's alien registration card since she never became a U.S. citizen. I often remembering wondering what it meant that she was an alien and why she had to register herself at a government office. Her immigration documents list her as coming in 1911 from a town in Austria called Kaszwy, which means crooked or curved in Polish. She never learned English, and yet I loved visiting her because she was warm, generous, and intuitive. I didn't know my Polish grandfather well because he died when I was 7. His immigration documents are murky, sometimes indicating that he was from Austria and sometimes from Russia. He arrived in the United States in 1910. While researching this book, I learned that he came into the country using a neighbor's name and documents. Thus, he entered the United States under another person's identity. That may account for the murkiness. This neighbor of his apparently could not leave their town in what is now southeastern Poland because of a dying parent, and so he gave his travel papers to my grandfather. My last surviving aunt, who died not long ago at the age of 93, confirmed that she had known of this story when she was a child, although she told me it was not ever discussed openly in the family. From today's perspective, he would have been an illegal immigrant, although that would not necessarily have been the case in 1910. Thank you for watching. I hope that I've made you interested in learning more about immigration and that you might want to order my book. You can get it through your local bookstore, or you can go to the publisher's website, which is www.routledge.com. Thank you for your attention.